When a billionaire woman publicly belittles her black maid's dream of becoming a singer, the maid seizes an opportunity to perform, stunning everyone with her remarkable talent and proving her doubters wrong. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the marble floors of Charlotte Prescott's mansion. Zuri Thompson navigated through clusters of wealthy guests, balancing a silver tray of champagne flutes. At 25, she'd worked as a server at countless high society events, but this one felt different. Maybe it was because she'd overheard Charlotte bragging about the famous music producers attending tonight. The mansion's grand ballroom buzzed with conversation, the air thick with expensive perfume and pretension. Zuri moved methodically between groups, her black uniform helping her blend into the background. She caught fragments of discussions about recent art acquisitions and upcoming symphony performances. "Darling, you simply must hear about the new soprano at the Metropolitan Opera," a woman in a red designer gown declared, waving her hand dismissively as Zuri offered her a fresh glass of champagne. The woman didn't even glance in her direction. Near the grand piano, a cluster of music industry executives debated the merits of various recording artists. Zuri slowed her pace, absorbing their conversation while pretending to arrange glasses on her tray. One producer mentioned looking for fresh talent with authenticity. Zuri's heart quickened. She'd been singing since she could talk, performing in church choirs and local venues whenever possible. The evening progressed smoothly until Charlotte Prescott, resplendent in a silver evening gown, clinked her glass for attention. The room fell silent as the billionaire socialite began her speech about the importance of supporting the arts. Zuri stood near the kitchen entrance, her tray empty, allowing herself a moment to listen. "The arts require proper breeding and education," Charlotte announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "Why, just yesterday, my housekeeper's girl, Zuri, isn't it, was singing while cleaning. She actually believes she could be a professional singer." Charlotte's laugh tinkled like ice in a crystal glass. Imagine someone like that performing at Carnegie Hall. The room erupted in polite laughter. Zuri felt every chuckle like a physical blow. Heat crept up her neck as dozens of eyes turned toward her, some curious, others openly amused. She forced herself to stand straight, though her hands trembled. "Back to the kitchen, dear," Charlotte called out, prompting another wave of laughter. Zuri retreated through the service entrance, her vision blurring. In the kitchen's fluorescent glare, she gripped the edge of a steel counter, drawing deep breaths. Other staff members avoided her gaze, continuing their work in uncomfortable silence. After her shift ended, Zuri drove to her grandmother's small house in a modest neighborhood across town. The contrast between the mansion's opulence and her grandmother's worn but welcoming living room couldn't have been starker. Rose Thompson, 78 years old with silver hair and kind eyes, took one look at her granddaughter's face and opened her arms. Zuri collapsed into her grandmother's embrace, finally letting the tears fall. "They laughed at me, Gran," she whispered, "like my dream was some kind of joke." Rose stroked Zuri's hair, her touch gentle but her voice firm. "Child, let me tell you about the days I sang jazz at the Blue Room." She pulled back, meeting Zuri's eyes. "Those fancy folks thought they owned music, but music belongs to the soul, not the wallet." Rose shuffled to an old cabinet and pulled out a yellowed photograph. It showed a young woman in a sparkly dress, standing proudly on a small stage. "That's me in 1962. We didn't have their money or the IR connections, but we had something they couldn't buy: authenticity." Zuri studied the photograph, seeing her grandmother's fierce determination reflected across decades. The same determination began to stir in her own chest, replacing the humiliation with something stronger. "They can laugh," Rose continued, her voice gaining strength. "But baby, while they're laughing, you better be planning. Your voice is a gift. Don't let anyone convince you it's worth less because of where it came from." This first section ends with Zuri wiping her tears, her grandmother's words taking root. The scene is set for her transformation from humiliated server to determined artist, though the full extent of her journey remains unrevealed. The morning after the humiliation at Charlotte's mansion, Zuri sat at her small kitchen table, laptop open before her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she searched for local talent competitions. A sponsored ad caught her eye: Star Search Detroit, grand prize $10,000 and recording studio time. Zuri clicked through to the registration page, her heart racing as she read the requirements. Entry fee, $250. Performance outfit required. She opened her banking app. Her savings account showed $487.23. After rent and utilities, she barely had enough for the entry fee, let alone a proper performance outfit. She pulled up her monthly budget spreadsheet, making brutal calculations. No morning coffee runs. Cancel her streaming subscriptions. Pick up extra weekend shifts at the diner. Maybe she could alter one of her church dresses for the performance. Every dollar would need to count. That afternoon, Zuri visited her grandmother again, this time with purpose. Rose's living room became their rehearsal space, the faded carpet their stage. Zuri stood near the window, sunlight streaming in as she practiced scales. Not from your throat, child, Rose corrected, sitting in her worn armchair. Sing from deeper, from where the pain lives, from where the joy hides. She stood up slowly, placing a hand on Zuri's diaphragm. Here, this is where your power comes from. Zuri closed her eyes, thinking of Charlotte's mocking laughter, of the years spent serving drinks to people who looked through her. She let her voice rise from that place of hurt and determination. The notes filled the small room, rich and raw. That's it, Rose whispered. Then, with unexpected energy, she moved to an old trunk in the corner. I've been waiting for the right time to show you these. She pulled out yellowed newspapers, playbills, and photographs. The materials documented Rose's career in Detroit's vibrant jazz scene of the 1960s. I wasn't just singing at the Blue Room, Rose revealed. I was part of a movement. We called ourselves the Midnight Voices, black artists creating spaces where we could be heard. Zuri carefully examined a photograph of her grandmother with a group of performers, their faces bright with defiance and joy. What happened to them, she asked. Rose's expression softened. Life happened. Some made it big, others gave up. I chose love, married your grandfather, had your mother, but I never regretted singing. It wasn't about making it big. It was about making our voices heard. Later that week, Zuri visited the community center where she'd heard other local artists practiced. In the basement room, she found a diverse group of performers preparing for various competitions and shows. Marcus, a spoken word artist with dreadlocks, was the first to welcome her. We've got singers, rappers, poets, everyone supporting each other, he explained. No judgment here, just growth. Tamika, a dance instructor, offered to help Zuri with stage presence. James, a music student, volunteered to play piano for her performance. The group's warmth stood in stark contrast to the cold elegance of Charlotte's mansion. Not everyone understood Zuri's commitment. Her mother worried about the financial risk. You've got a steady job, she argued. During Sunday dinner, why risk everything for a dream? Her co-workers at the diner whispered about her practicing during breaks. Some regulars left bigger tips with encouraging notes, while others made jokes about American Idol rejects. But in the community center's basement, none of that mattered. The group became her sanctuary. They shared techniques, critiqued each other's performances, and offered shoulders to cry on after rough days. One evening, as they all sat in a circle sharing their stories, Zuri realized something profound. Her grandmother's midnight voices hadn't just been about music. They'd been about community, about creating strength through unity. She looked around the room, at Marcus crafting verses about urban life, at Tamika teaching a young girl to dance, at James composing on his worn keyboard. They were all part of something bigger than themselves. The $250 entry fee no longer seemed like just a ticket to a competition. It was an investment in becoming part of this legacy, this continuous thread of artists supporting artists, of voices refusing to be silenced. The community group decided to hold their practice session in Palmer Park one sunny Saturday morning. The open space offered better acoustics than the basement, and the fresh air energized their performances. Zuri arrived early, helping James set up his portable keyboard under a sprawling oak tree. Their informal showcase attracted a small crowd of joggers and families. Tamika led a warm-up, her dance moves drawing curious onlookers. Marcus performed a powerful spoken-word piece about urban renewal. Then it was Zuri's turn to practice her competition piece. She had just opened her mouth to sing when loud laughter cut through the morning air. A group of young people in designer athleisure were approached, and Zuri immediately recognized several faces from Charlotte's parties. "Look who it is," called out Blake Harrison, Charlotte's nephew. The singing Maid and her little street performers. He pulled out his phone, clearly planning to record for mockery on social media. Zuri's throat tightened. The memory of Charlotte's party threatened to overwhelm her. James stepped forward protectively, but she held up her hand to stop him. Something shifted inside her. The humiliation she'd felt at the mansion transformed into fuel. Without accompaniment, Zuri began to sing. Not her competition piece, but an old spiritual her grandmother had taught her. Her voice carried across the park, rich with generations of defiance and dignity. The first verse silenced the mockers. By the second, more park visitors stopped to listen. As she built to the chorus, her fellow artists joined in, Marcus adding a rhythm, Tamika swaying with interpretive movement, James finding the chords on his keyboard. The performance drew a growing crowd. Phone cameras turned toward her, but now they were recording in appreciation, not mockery. Blake and his friends retreated, their attempt at harassment transformed into an impromptu concert. When the song ended, spontaneous applause erupted from the gathered crowd. An elderly man wiped tears from his eyes. "I haven't heard that song since my grandmother sang it," he told Zuri. "You made it yours while honoring its history." The group's regular audience members began sharing the story on social media, not just of the performance, but of the attempted harassment and how Zuri had transformed it. Local community pages picked up the story. Comments poured in about similar experiences of discrimination in the arts. During their cool-down, Marcus pulled out his phone to show Zuri the growing online response. "This is bigger than the competition now," he said. "People are asking where they can hear you perform." Tamika nodded enthusiastically. "We should organize our own showcase, something that highlights voices from the community that usually get ignored." The idea took root immediately. James suggested combining their different art forms into a cohesive show. Others began offering connections. Someone knew a local venue owner. Another had a friend who did sound engineering. Zuri felt simultaneously excited and overwhelmed. "The competition is in 3 weeks," she reminded them. "I need to focus on that." "This isn't a distraction," Marcus insisted. "It's ammunition. Every great artist needs a cause bigger than themselves. This is yours, making space for voices like ours in places they try to keep us out of." That evening, Zuri created a simple social media page, Voices of Detroit. She posted a clip from the park performance, along with a message about artistic gatekeeping and the importance of diverse voices in the arts. Before bed, she checked the page one last time. The post had hundreds of shares, dozens of comments from people sharing similar stories. Local artists asked how they could get involved. A small venue offered their space for future performances. Looking at the responses, Zuri realized she'd stumbled onto something vital. Her personal humiliation at Charlotte's mansion had exposed a larger truth: that talent and artistry weren't confined to elegant ballrooms and expensive venues. She thought about her grandmother's midnight voices, how they created their own spaces when existing ones excluded them. Now, decades later, Zuri was doing the same thing, not just for herself, but for every artist who'd ever been told they didn't belong. The day of the Star Search Detroit competition arrived with a mix of rain and nervous energy. Zuri arrived at the downtown theater 2 hours early, carrying her grandmother's altered dress in a garment bag. The backstage area buzzed with activity. Singers warming up, makeup artists working frantically, stage hands running final checks. In the cramped dressing room, Zuri hung her dress carefully. The vintage black silk, once worn by Rose at the Blue Room, had been carefully restyled by Tamika's aunt, a seamstress. They'd added subtle blue beading that caught the light when she moved, done with threads from Rose's old performance costumes. As she applied her makeup, Zuri's hands trembled slightly. From the mirror, she could see other contestants, many wearing designer outfits, some accompanied by professional styling teams. One girl practiced with a vocal coach who, Zuri realized with a start, had worked with several Grammy winners. Her phone buzzed with encouraging messages. The community center group was already in the audience. Her grandmother, too weak to attend in person, had sent a voice message. "Remember, baby, music isn't about being perfect. It's about being true." 30 minutes before showtime, Zuri went through her vocal warm-ups in a quiet corner. The contestant before her, a young man in an expensive suit, practiced runs that seemed designed to showcase technical skill rather than emotion. Stage managers began calling contestants to the wings. Zuri took her place in line, number 23 out of 30 performers. From behind the curtain, she could hear the polite applause, the occasional enthusiastic cheer, the subtle murmur of the judges' discussions. As she waited, Zuri noticed someone familiar in the wings, one of the producers from Charlotte's party. He was speaking with the judges during breaks, his presence a reminder of the world that had tried to exclude her. When they called number 23, Zuri walked onto the stage with measured steps, just as Tamika had taught her. The lights were blinding, the audience a dark mass beyond them. She took her position at the microphone, feeling the weight of her grandmother's dress, the history it carried. The opening notes of her chosen song began. A contemporary R&B ballad she'd rearranged to incorporate elements of gospel and jazz, bridging generations of musical tradition. As she started to sing, everything else faded away. She thought of Charlotte's mockery, of her grandmother's strength, of the community that had rallied around her. Each memory added depth to her voice, turning technical notes into raw emotion. When she hit the bridge, she added a run that Rose had taught her, a flourish that spoke of smoky jazz clubs and defiant joy. In the audience, she could make out Marcus and the others, standing as she built to the crescendo. The producer in the wings had stopped his conversation, watching with undisguised interest. Even the stage hands had paused their work. As she held the final note, Zuri opened her eyes fully, finally seeing the audience. They were on their feet, not just her friends, but the entire theater. The applause wasn't polite, it was thunderous. Someone shouted, "That's how it's done." Another voice called out, "Detroit represent." The judges leaned forward in their seats, whispering intensely. The producer pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Zuri hardly noticed any of it. In that moment, she felt her grandmother's presence, heard the echoes of the midnight voices, sensed the legacy she was now part of. Backstage, other contestants congratulated her, even the ones with expensive coaches. The young man in the suit asked where she trained. When she mentioned the community center, he looked genuinely surprised. As she changed out of her grandmother's dress, Zuri's phone buzzed again. Rose had somehow gotten someone to film the performance and send it to her. Her message was simple. "You didn't just sing, baby. You testified." In the competition's green room, as performers awaited the final results, Marcus burst in with news that Zuri's performance was already trending locally on social media. The hashtag Voices of Detroit had exploded, with clips of her performance being shared thousands of times. Jerome Hayes, the producer she'd recognized from Charlotte's party, approached her with a business card in hand. "That was unexpected," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "We should talk about your future. My label specializes in developing new talent." Before Zuri could respond, the judges called everyone back to the stage for the results. Under the bright lights, standing among the other contestants, she felt both powerful and vulnerable. When they announced her as the winner, the theater erupted. The community center group's cheers were the loudest, their joy infectious. But the celebration was short-lived. The next morning, while Zuri was still processing her victory, her phone started buzzing with concerned messages. Charlotte Prescott had launched a social media campaign against her. "Talent isn't enough," Charlotte's first post read. "True artists understand tradition and respect. Some people mistake volume for virtue." It was carefully worded but clear in its target. More posts followed, each more pointed than the last. Charlotte shared old photos of Zuri from her serving days, suggesting she'd been unprofessional. There were implications about stolen silverware, about eavesdropping on private conversations. None of it was true, but the damage was spreading. Some of Charlotte's wealthy friends joined in, sharing stories about Zuri's supposed bad behavior at various events. One claimed she'd been caught trying to steal sheet music from a piano at a charity gala. Another suggested she'd been fired from multiple serving jobs. All lies. Jerome Hayes called his tone less enthusiastic than before. This kind of controversy can be complicated, he said. Perhaps we should wait for things to settle before discussing any contracts. Zuri sat in her apartment, watching her moment of triumph threaten to unravel. Her phone kept buzzing, some messages supportive, others asking if the accusations were true. A local news website had picked up the story, framing it as a class conflict in Detroit's art scene. When she arrived at the diner for her shift, her manager pulled her aside. Some customers have complained, he said uncomfortably. Maybe you should take a few days off until this blows over. That evening, she went to the community center, feeling defeated. But what she found there changed everything. The basement was packed, not just with her usual group, but with dozens of local artists. They'd seen the attacks and had come to show support. Marcus had compiled evidence countering each of Charlotte's claims. Tamika had gathered testimonials from other service workers about Zuri's character. James had reached out to his music school professors about creating performance opportunities outside the mainstream industry. "They're scared," an elderly jazz musician said, his voice carrying years of similar experiences. "You did something they didn't expect. You showed that talent doesn't need their permission to shine." As they talked, a plan began to form. Instead of fighting Charlotte's accusations directly, they would show Detroit what real community-supported art looked like. The viral moment of Zuri's competition performance wasn't just about her voice. It was about everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. "Let them post their lies," Marcus declared. "We'll respond with truth. Not just your truth, but all of ours." The group began organizing an event, part concert, part protest, part celebration. Local venues that had seen Zuri's performance offered their spaces. Other artists who'd faced similar discrimination volunteered to perform. Rose called during the planning session. "Charlotte Prescott isn't the first to try to silence our music," she said. "But baby, she's about to learn what we learned back in my day. Our voices get stronger when they try to quiet them." By midnight, #Voices of Detroit had evolved from a hashtag about one performance into a movement. Artists across the city shared stories of exclusion and resilience. The very audience Charlotte was trying to turn against Zuri was instead becoming invested in the larger story of artistic gatekeeping and community resistance. The recording studio was nothing like Zuri had imagined. Instead of the warm, creative space she'd dreamed of, she found herself in a sterile environment where producers talked more about marketability than music. Despite Charlotte's attempts to discredit her, several small labels had shown interest after her competition video went viral. "Your sound needs polishing," said Trevor, a producer at Midwest Records. He played back her latest recording, now heavily processed with auto-tune. "We need to make it more accessible." The word felt like a euphemism for something else. Zuri listened to the modified version of her song, barely recognizing her own voice beneath the digital alterations. They'd stripped away the jazz influences, removed the gospel undertones, and added a generic pop beat. Everything that made the song personal, everything that connected it to her grandmother's legacy, was gone. "This isn't what I want," she said, standing up from the mixing board. "My voice doesn't need this much processing." Trevor exchanged looks with the other producers. "Look, Zuri, you need to understand how the industry works. Raw talent isn't enough. We know it sells." Meanwhile, across town, Charlotte Prescott was orchestrating her biggest move yet. She announced the Detroit Heritage Music Festival, a high-profile event celebrating authentic Detroit talent. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was scheduled for the same weekend as the community showcase Zuri and her friends had been planning. Charlotte's connections ensured her festival received immediate media attention. Major sponsors signed on, attracted by her promises of featuring properly trained artists. Local venues, pressured by potential future business opportunities, began pulling out of Zuri's event. Back at the community center, the group faced their shrinking options. "She's trying to drown us out," Marcus observed, scrolling through news of Charlotte's festival. "Make our event look small and amateur in comparison." But Zuri had reached a breaking point. The studio sessions, Charlotte's festival, the constant pressure to conform. It all crystallized into a moment of clarity. Then let's be amateur, she declared. Let's be raw. Let's be everything they're afraid of. She pulled up the heavily produced studio track on her phone and deleted it. We don't need their polish. We need our truth. The group began reimagining their event. Instead of competing with Charlotte's polished festival, they would embrace their grassroots nature. They found an abandoned warehouse in their neighborhood, a space with history, its walls still echoing with the city's industrial past. Word spread through community networks. Local businesses, initially hesitant to oppose Charlotte publicly, began offering quiet support. A soul food restaurant promised to feed the performers. A printing shop donated flyers. A retired sound engineer volunteered his equipment. But Charlotte wasn't finished. She scheduled press appearances, speaking about maintaining standards in the arts and the importance of proper training. Without naming Zuri directly, she made it clear what she thought about self-taught artists from working-class backgrounds. Then came her masterstroke. She announced that her festival would be free, sponsored by corporate donors, while heavily publicizing that Zuri's event was charging a modest cover fee to pay the performers. She's trying to price us out of our own community, Tamika realized during an emergency meeting. Zuri stood in the warehouse, looking at the makeshift stage they'd built, listening to the group discuss their dwindling options. The space reminded her of the old photographs of her grandmother's jazz club, raw, real, filled with possibility. We're not canceling, she announced. And we're not changing our plans. Charlotte wants to make this about money. Let's make it about purpose instead. She grabbed her phone and started a live stream, walking through the warehouse, showing their preparations. She talked about the history of Detroit's music scene, about communities creating their own spaces when existing ones excluded them. This isn't just about music, she told her growing online audience. It's about who gets to decide what art is valuable. Our festival might not have corporate sponsors, but it has something more important. It has soul. The stream went viral, tapping into conversations about gentrification, cultural appropriation, and artistic authenticity. Other artists began sharing similar stories, creating a counter-narrative to Charlotte's polished marketing campaign. The battle lines were drawn. Two festivals, two visions of art, two versions of Detroit, about to collide on the same weekend. The morning of the warehouse show dawned with an electric energy in the air. The line of people waiting to enter stretched around the block, a diverse crowd of local residents, artists, students, and even some defectors from Charlotte's festival across town. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed. String lights crisscrossed the ceiling, creating a warm glow. Local artists had covered the walls with murals celebrating Detroit's musical heritage, from Motown to hip-hop, jazz to techno. Each corner told a story of the city's creative spirit. The show opened with a series of performances by community artists. A teenage rapper spoke about growing up in the city's east side. A jazz quartet played compositions inspired by factory rhythms. Poets wove stories about generational resilience. Each performer shared not just their art, but their journey. When it was Zuri's turn, she took the stage wearing her grandmother's dress again, but this time paired with work boots, a deliberate statement about bridging worlds. The warehouse fell silent as she began to sing. Her first song was the one the studio had tried to modify. Here, stripped of production tricks, her voice filled the space with raw emotion. She followed it with the spiritual from the park, then transitioned into an original composition about her experiences serving at elite parties. Between songs, she shared stories about her grandmother's jazz days, about the nights practicing in the community center basement, about the friends who stood by her when Charlotte tried to destroy her reputation. The audience responded with shouts of recognition and encouragement. This next song, she announced, is for everyone who's ever been told their voice doesn't matter. She nodded to James at the piano, and together they launched into a powerful anthem about reclaiming spaces and telling untold stories. The audience joined in on the chorus, their voices merging with hers. The warehouse walls seemed to vibrate with the collective energy. Someone started streaming the performance live, and views quickly climbed into the thousands. During intermission, News spread that several artists had canceled their appearances at Charlotte's festival to come perform at the warehouse instead. A respected jazz critic from the Detroit Free Press arrived, drawn by the growing buzz on social media. The second half of the show became a spontaneous celebration of community talent. Artists in the audience asked to perform. Impromptu collaborations formed on stage. Genre boundaries dissolved as classical musicians jammed with street performers. Opera singers harmonized with rappers. Rose watched it all through a video call, projected onto one of the warehouse walls. Her presence, even virtually, felt like a bridge between past and present. When Zuri performed one of her grandmother's old songs, Rose sang along from her living room, her voice joining her granddaughters across generations. Messages poured in from around the city. People shared their own stories of being excluded from traditional venues. Videos of the performances spread rapidly, accompanied by hashtags about artistic authenticity and community power. A local news crew arrived, drawn by reports of the unprecedented gathering. Their coverage captured the contrast between the corporate polish of Charlotte's festival and the raw authenticity of the warehouse show. "This isn't just a concert," Zuri told the reporter. "It's a reminder that art belongs to everyone, that talent doesn't wait for permission, that every voice deserves to be heard." The evening ended with all the performers on stage, leading the audience in a song that blended elements of gospel, jazz, and hip-hop, a uniquely Detroit sound that could never have emerged from a corporate-sponsored event. As the last notes faded, Zuri looked out at the crowd, at the faces lit with joy and possibility, at the barriers being broken, at the new connections being formed. She realized they created something Charlotte could never buy or control, a genuine movement. The warehouse show had become more than a response to Charlotte's festival. It was a declaration of independence, a reclaiming of artistic space, a demonstration of community power. And it was just the beginning. The success of the warehouse show forced Charlotte's hand. Rather than continuing her indirect attacks, she arrived unannounced at Zuri's community center rehearsal the following week. The room fell silent as the billionaire socialite, looking out of place in her designer suit, strode directly toward Zuri. "We need to talk," Charlotte announced, her voice tight with controlled anger. Privately, Zuri stood her ground, surrounded by her fellow artists. "Anything you need to say to me, you can say in front of them." Charlotte's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "Fine. I'm here to warn you. I have information about your past that could end this little rebellion of yours." Marcus stepped forward protectively, but Zuri raised her hand to stop him. "What information, Charlotte? That I worked multiple jobs to support my grandmother? That I served drinks at your parties while dreaming of something better? Go ahead, expose that." Charlotte pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers trembling slightly. "What about the night you sang at the Blue Room 3 years ago? When you were asked to leave for fighting with the owner?" For a moment, Zuri felt her confidence waver. That night had been one of her lowest points, a misunderstanding that had turned ugly. But then she remembered something her grandmother had taught her about facing fear. "You want to talk about the Blue Room?" Zuri's voice grew stronger. "Let's talk about who owned it then. Let's talk about how they were pushing out local artists to make way for more sophisticated entertainment. Let's talk about how many other singers got blacklisted for speaking up." Charlotte's face paled slightly. Zuri continued, years of observation as a server having taught her to read people's reactions. "But you already know all about that, don't you? Because it was your money behind those changes. Your vision of what Detroit music should be." The room grew tense as understanding dawned. Charlotte's crusade against Zuri wasn't just about one servant who dared to dream. It was about maintaining control over the city's cultural narrative. "You don't understand what it takes to preserve artistic standards," Charlotte snapped, but her voice held a note of defensiveness. "Without proper guidance, without the right connections, like the connections you had?" Zuri interrupted. "Tell me, Charlotte, how did you start in the arts? What opportunities did your family name by you?" Something shifted in Charlotte's expression, a crack in her armor that revealed unexpected vulnerability. "My father," she started, then stopped. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. "Your father was Richard Prescott." Marcus spoke up, reading from his phone. The man who closed down half the jazz clubs in Paradise Valley in the 1960s to build his real estate empire. Charlotte's hands clenched into fists. He was creating something better, something world-class. He was erasing our history, Zuri said quietly. Just like you're trying to do now. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken truths. Charlotte's perfectly maintained facade showed hairline fractures. For a moment, Zuri glimpsed something familiar in her opponent's eyes, the shadow of old wounds, of expectations that had become chains. You're not so different from us, Zuri realized aloud. You're just trapped in a different kind of box. Charlotte took an unsteady step backward, her carefully constructed worldview visibly shaking. You don't know anything about me. I know what it's like to have someone else try to define your voice, Zuri responded. The only difference is I found people who helped me break free. You're still singing someone else's song. The confrontation had shifted from a battle of power to something more complex, a recognition of shared struggles, though fought from opposite sides of a divide. As Charlotte turned to leave, Zuri called after her. It's not too late to change the tune, Charlotte. Real music isn't about preserving barriers. It's about breaking them down. The door closed behind Charlotte, leaving the room in thoughtful silence. The threat she'd arrived with had transformed into something unexpected, a glimpse into the complicated legacy of Detroit's cultural battles, and perhaps a first step toward understanding. The video of Zuri's confrontation with Charlotte, captured by someone in the community center, had gone viral overnight. Music industry insiders who had been cautiously watching her career now saw her as more than just a talented voice. She was becoming a symbol of artistic authenticity in an increasingly corporatized industry. The offer for a regional tour came from an unexpected source, a coalition of independent venues across the Midwest. No corporate sponsorship, the organizer explained. Just real music for real people. Your story is resonating way beyond Detroit. Zuri sat in her grandmother's living room, the tour contract spread out on the coffee table. Rose studied it through her reading glasses, her expression hotful. 20 cities in 3 months, she mused. That's a lot of road, baby. The thought of leaving Detroit, even temporarily, filled Zuri with conflicting emotions. The community center group had become family. Her grandmother's health was increasingly fragile. Yet the opportunity to spread their message, to inspire other communities, pulled at her. I can't leave everyone behind, Zuri said, looking around the familiar room filled with memories. This movement isn't just about me. Rose reached for her hand. Who said anything about leaving us behind? Back in my day, the midnight voices traveled together. Strength in numbers, we used to say. The idea took root quickly. Marcus could perform his spoken word between sets. Tamika could incorporate her dance elements. James would play piano. They could showcase different local artists in each city, creating connections between communities. But practical concerns arose. Most of the group had jobs they couldn't simply abandon. The tour budget was modest. Multiple hotel rooms would stretch it thin. The logistics of traveling with Rose, given her health needs, seemed daunting. Maybe I should wait, Zuri suggested during a group meeting. Build our foundation here first. Or maybe, Tamika countered, this is exactly how we build that foundation. By showing other cities what's possible when communities come together. They began problem-solving as a group. James's music school agreed to count the tour as his required internship. Tamika's dance students organized fundraisers. Marcus started a crowdfunding campaign that quickly gained traction. The most surprising solution came from an unlikely source. The elderly jazz musician who'd supported them at the warehouse show offered his renovated tour bus from his own performing days. It ain't fancy, he said, but it's got heart. Just like your music. As preparations intensified, Zuri struggled with larger questions. Would success change her? Would distance from her roots affect her authenticity? The same industry she'd critiqued was starting to take notice. What if she became what she'd fought against? Late one night, rehearsing in the community center, she voiced these fears to her friends. What if we get out there and people don't understand what we're trying to do? What if we lose what makes this special? Marcus looked up from his notebook. You remember what you told Charlotte? About singing someone else's song? As long as we stay true to our voice, We can't lose our way. The tour dates were finalized. Their first stop would be Cleveland, another city with a rich musical history and similar struggles between grassroots art and corporate influence. Local organizations there had already reached out, eager to connect their communities. Rose insisted on coming for the first week. "Just to see you off properly," she said, though everyone knew she wanted to make sure they were ready. She spent hours teaching them old road songs, sharing stories about touring in segregated America, preparing them for the challenges ahead. The night before departure, Zuri returned to the warehouse where they'd held their show. Standing on the empty stage, she sang softly to herself, not performing, just letting her voice fill the space. The sound bounced off the walls, carrying echoes of recent triumph and future possibilities. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a link to a new music blog post about upcoming artists to watch. The author had written, "Zuri Thompson isn't just creating music. She's creating spaces where forgotten voices can be heard. Her upcoming tour isn't just performances. It's a movement in motion." The tour's success had exceeded everyone's expectations, with packed venues and growing media attention. But it was the letter waiting for Zuri in Minneapolis, their 18th stop, that changed everything. The unmarked envelope contained detailed documentation of systematic attempts to undermine her career, all traced back to Charlotte Prescott. Emails revealed how Charlotte had pressured venue owners not to book Zuri. There were records of payments to critics for negative reviews and evidence of a coordinated campaign to question Zuri's authenticity. The most damning revelation was proof that Charlotte had been secretly buying up historic music venues across Detroit, planning to renovate them into upscale entertainment spaces. "This could destroy her," Marcus said, reviewing the documents. "One press release, and everything she's built crumbles." Zuri sat in the tour bus, surrounded by her chosen family, wrestling with the decision. The easy choice would be revenge. Charlotte had certainly shown no mercy. But something about the desperation behind these actions suggested a deeper story. Instead of calling the press, Zuri did something unexpected. She called Charlotte directly. "We need to talk," Zuri said when Charlotte answered. "Not as enemies. Just talk." The silence on the other end lasted so long that Zuri thought Charlotte had hung up. Finally, "I'm listening. Meet me at the Blue Room. Tonight. Just you and me." The Blue Room stood dark and empty when Zuri arrived after their evening show. Charlotte was already there, sitting at the bar, looking smaller somehow, without her usual entourage. "Why?" Zuri asked simply, taking the seat beside her. "Why go to such lengths to stop me?" Charlotte stared at her glass. "You want to know the truth? I was just like you once, singing in places like this, dreaming big dreams. But my father—" She paused, gathering herself. "He said Prescott's don't perform. We own stages. We don't stand on them." The revelation hung in the air between them. Charlotte continued, her carefully constructed facade cracking. "Every time I heard you sing, it reminded me of who I could have been. If I'd had your courage." "It's not too late," Zuri said quietly. "Your father's not here anymore. His rules don't have to be yours." Charlotte laughed bitterly. "You think it's that simple? Look at what I've done. The people I've hurt. The venues I've closed." "Then help us reopen them," Zuri suggested. "Not as exclusive clubs, but as spaces for everyone. Use your influence to preserve our music history, not erase it." "Why would you offer me that chance? After everything?" Zuri thought about her grandmother's words about healing old wounds through music. "Because art isn't about revenge. It's about transformation." The idea took shape between them, a partnership that would shock both their worlds. Charlotte's resources and connections combined with Zuri's community ties and artistic vision. Together, they could create something unprecedented, a network of venues that bridged Detroit's divided music scene. The announcement came during the tour's final show back in Detroit. The warehouse was packed when Charlotte walked on a stage, facing the community she'd once tried to silence. Her hands shook as she took the microphone. "I owe you all an apology," she began. "And more than that, I owe you a promise." She outlined their plan for preserving and revitalizing Detroit's historic music spaces, ensuring they remained accessible to all artists. Then, In a moment that would be talked about for years, Charlotte did something no one expected. She sang. Her voice, unused for decades, carried the weight of suppressed dreams and newfound freedom. Zuri joined her, their voices blending in an unlikely but powerful harmony. The performance became a symbol of possibility, proof that even the deepest divides could be bridged through music. As the applause washed over them, Zuri glimpsed her grandmother in the audience, tears streaming down her face, witnessing the completion of a circle decades in the making. The story spread beyond Detroit, inspiring similar transformations in other cities. But more importantly, it showed that true artistic revolution isn't just about fighting against something, it's about creating space for everyone's voice to be heard. In the end, Zuri hadn't just found her voice. She'd helped others reclaim theirs, including the person she'd least expected. The silence had been broken, replaced by a chorus of voices rising together, proving that music's greatest power lies not in perfection, but in its ability to heal, unite, and transform. The stage lights dimmed, but this wasn't an ending. It was a prelude to something bigger, a new song, waiting to be sung.